So I'm Terry Campbell. I'm here to moderate today. We've got wonderful panelists for you to hear from. I'm going to start off by just doing a little bit of what I call housekeeping, and that is to tell you how we're going to organize and do things. We will have 4 10-minute presentations, one from each of our presenters. After that, we're going to open the mic up and we're going to have an opportunity for all of you all to help us in the learning we need to do together this afternoon. We're going to look for comments and questions for our panelists, and we're going to have a dialogue and some learning time together. I'm going to start by framing what we're doing just very, very shortly and with some short introductions. And I will be inviting each of the panelists to tell you a little bit more about themselves when they come up to do their presentation. We are going to follow the order that was listed in the program books. So with that, let me just kick this off. We talked about this being a session called A Local to Global Story. Our principles are artists' positive change in the community, and the sectors we think we're looking at here are art and business, art and economics and community development, and art and politics. I'll use that point to say that what I do in my day job is work in politics. I work for a U.S. Senator, and I hope I can say that a month from now.
You will. We're very confident. You will.
I'll be saying it a month from now if you all show up on elections right. Can Detroit forge and lead a new sustainable arts and cultural industry as it once did with the auto industry? I know a little bit about the auto industry. I spent the first 25 years of my career in the auto industry working for General Motors. I just want to say probably the key word in that sentence to me is sustainable. We can do anything, but can we sustain it? Can we make it so that people can really earn a living and have a flourishing community while doing it? So I'm really interested in exploring this with our panelists and with all of you this afternoon. All of our panelists have lived and or traveled internationally. They're going to bring perspectives from their experiences all over the world. Julie Egan has had 2 decades of global experience. She was a diplomat with the State Department and a senior Obama official. She's using diplomacy here in Detroit to facilitate conversations and build bridges. Dietrich Nohr was born and raised in Germany. He has over 2 decades of professional experience. He's been a Detroiter since 2013. Once a Detroiter, always a Detroiter, so we're really happy to have him here. He's working in real estate development here, and he's helping some things to do some things in the community to educate folks. Jules Polk is an artist, philanthropist, and teacher, traveled widely. She is a board member of Heidelberg Project, and we're very happy to have her here with us today. Aku Kadego is a theater director, a creative producer, and educator. She now calls Georgia home, but she's a Detroiter, and once a Detroiter, always a Detroiter. She is helping educate the beautiful minds down at Spelman, and she's here with us today. And I will ask each of you to come up. I know each of our presenters has a slide presentation for us to look at, so we'll pay attention to that. We'll have the 4 presentations, then we'll shift them to the front here, and we'll begin the dialogue with everyone. Sound okay?
Sounds great.
Great.
Wonderful. So I think, Julie, you're going to kick us off.
All right, how is everyone today?
Great.
By show of hands, how many people are enjoying the conference? Everyone? Yes. All right, great. My name is Julie Egan. I have spent most of my adult life working on the issues that we're about to discuss, so I feel really honored to be able to talk with you today. I was born in Detroit, as was my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, but I left Detroit for about 20 years, was mostly overseas, and then came home and now live live back here in Detroit, and so I'm excited to kind of share a little bit about what I've been doing in Detroit since I've been back to continue to build these kinds of global bridges with Detroit, for Detroit, as a partner in Detroit, because there's a way for all of us in this room and all Detroiters really to be urban diplomats on behalf of Detroit, to basically do what I did, but to do it on behalf of the city of Detroit. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So I'll start by just, I'll say a little bit about what I did as examples and take you on a little bit of a tour of what I was lucky enough to be able to do with Detroiters to build bridges between Detroiters in the cultural space and in social innovation and entrepreneurs and in other areas in Detroit. But first I just want to talk about the idea of urban diplomacy. What is that? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea of cities, urban spaces, developing global relationships directly without having to go through an intermediary like a national government. And I'll talk a little bit in the presentation about what's happening in the world and how this is becoming a thing. And in fact, I believe that the future of international relations is actually between cities, for all the reasons that probably you all already know, because the city is really the most important space, I think, in the world right now. And so I just wanted to start with this idea of, sort of how can the cultural sector in Detroit be what the auto industry was 100 years ago? And I think the answer to that lies in how many relationships we can all develop as Detroiters individually without having to rely on a specific industry with other places in the world. Because, when I traveled on behalf of the US government to other places, people knew Detroit, obviously. We've all had that experience in some way, shape, or form. People would say, oh yeah, I know Detroit, it's cars and it's culture. Often it was music, but it wasn't always music, it was artists. And in fact, Tyree doesn't even know the story, but I have a long relationship with the Heidelberg Project that predates my professional life as a kid growing up. And when I traveled overseas, I traveled with artifacts from the Heidelberg Project. When I was in Libya and Tunisia and in Paris and other places. I primarily served in Africa and the Middle East, but when I traveled, I brought Detroit art with me, and part of that art was from the Heidelberg Project. And it was a way to start conversation, and it was a way to talk about what mattered in Detroit, and the fact that Detroit was a place where it was showing leadership in all kinds of ways instead of just in the auto sector. So that just sort of gets to the why we're here today, because the Heidelberg Project has been already conducting and building relationships overseas. It's one of the most visited places in Detroit for international visitors. So Tyree and the Heidelberg Project has already been forging this kind of urban diplomacy, and so what I'd like to do in the presentation is just distill from that what we all could be doing in other facets of the arts and cultural space to follow that lead and follow that example. So we're going to talk about Detroit diplomacy and art diplomacy. This is my company. I won't get into it much, but it's basically the idea of bringing people together for face-to-face conversations to conduct this kind of cultural diplomacy, which is sort of what I'm doing now. I like to refer to it as diplomacy on my own terms, to support not necessarily a national agenda, but an urban diplomacy agenda, but also to support people and movements that matter to me. And this is kind of the model that we use. It's an old salon model. It's based on what women have been doing for centuries in intimate environments, bringing people together over food and drink and art, to strategic matchmake, to seduce, to build relationships, to tell stories. And so this is sort of what we're doing, but it just goes back to that idea of building bridges and building relationships here and abroad. So by way of telling this story, I'll tell you a little bit about my background and what I was doing over the last few years to kind of build this urban diplomacy idea here in Detroit. So I had the great privilege of working for someone who I respect more than anyone else on this planet, Barack Obama. I came to that position from my work at the State Department. I was sort of cherry-picked to represent the Secretary of State on a team of 5 people that were sent to Detroit during the Obama administration as a way of expressing the importance that that President Obama put on what was happening in Detroit and the recovery in Detroit. And so there were 5 of us that represented 5 different cabinet secretaries, everything from HUD to energy to Treasury to others. It was kind of a joke a little bit at the beginning inside the State Department, like you're being sent to the foreign country called Detroit, like how does that work? And in fact, there was something to that. Detroit is really its own special thing, and so it was a little bit like going to a different country. But for me, it was also like going home because this is where I'm from, and so it was a really special opportunity to be able to go home and serve my community. I did things a lot, like walk around the White House and the West Wing and other places wearing Detroit paraphernalia. It was my job. I became a marketing machine for Detroit. I took it really seriously. Everywhere I went, I either wore Detroit designers, Detroit jewelers, I brought Detroit artists with me. It became a full-time Detroit branding extravaganza. And this is a point I'll get to later, but this is one way we can all be urban diplomats for Detroit, which is that when we travel, when we're in other places, that we are representing all the great things that are happening here, especially if we have a platform and an exposure to different places. We built this campaign, the social media campaign called Detroit Diplomacy, which I'll talk about, but it was also just a way of using social media to build relationships and to sort of help tell the story of what was going on in Detroit and globally as well as in other places in the US. I'm just going to zip through a bunch of photos, but we did a bunch of things where, as part of this position that I had, building bridges between Detroit and other places in the world, we took Detroiters from all backgrounds who were focused on all kinds of things, entrepreneurs, social innovators who had created solutions to really challenging problems that other places in the world wanted to learn from these leaders in Detroit, and so we facilitated the sharing of their stories and their experiences in other places in the world. The photo on the right is at the Venice Architecture Biennale, which of course Detroit was featured a couple years ago, and on the right is the Great Wall of China. Here, this is an interesting story. We brought Detroiters to participate in President Obama's Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and then also brought social innovators to Tunisia after the revolution there. And in particular, one example of a Detroit soup, we launched Detroit soup in Tunisia and also in a remote area in Tunisia that was a remote area that was close to where the revolution began, and this model has taken root and continues to grow and flourish in Tunisia as a way of creating funding for creative entrepreneurs in that country. So I want to just talk a little bit about just this notion of urban diplomacy and sort of why it matters, and what are the opportunities. So I've mentioned this idea of building, identifying areas that Detroit is well known for and finding ways to be able to promote that on a global platform. Many people probably aware that the United Nations designated Detroit the first city in the United States as a UNESCO City of Design. That was an example of a project that we work to facilitate, and there are other types of designations like this UN designation that members of the creative community in Detroit could come together and think about promoting in music and craft and other creative sectors. One of the reasons that this is so important and so timely is that we know that mass urbanization is one of the biggest trends in the world right now in terms of what's going to impact the future. And we were often asked, well, how does this matter to everyday people in Detroit, but also in other cities across the United States? And one of the things that that's really interesting and important that we focused on was the idea that in 20 years from now, more than 85% of clients or customers for small businesses. So if you are running a business in Detroit, putting food on the table for your families, or employing other people, we know that in the next 20 to 30 years, 85% of that customer base is not going to be in the United States. So what is the implication of that for all of us who want to create economic opportunity for our families and for the future, in terms of what are the skills and what are the bridges that we need to be building in order to have those connections and have those skills and have those relationships around the world. So we started to look at how we could build organization in Detroit that would kind of act as a mini State Department for the city of Detroit. So how could we represent ourselves globally? We don't really have a structure right now, so there was questions around how we could build that. Just wanting to touch on that very briefly, because I think as we think about the cultural industries here in Detroit and what's happening in arts and culture in Detroit, what are the ways that we can work together through a structure, as well as through various organizations and and individually, to create an easy way for all of us to connect to opportunities around the world. And so we started to think about this idea of what would it be like for Detroit to have its own urban diplomatic corps. So if you think about the State Department and the folks who, like where I worked, and the folks who are overseas working in embassies, working on our behalf, doing things, everything from if you get lost or thrown in jail, then there's someone that comes and helps you while you're overseas, which is really nice. But the State Department, like one of the lesser known facts about what a diplomat does overseas is we're kind of like your personal marketing division. So the State Department and U.S. diplomats abroad are basically the marketing arm of U.S. business. And also sort of like the sales team for U.S. business. We have people overseas that basically are selling your company or selling why you should care about the United States overseas. And so, as we're all creative and thinking creatively, I think it could be an interesting thought exercise and way to use our creativity to think together around what would it be like for there to be a Detroit version of this, for there to be a group of people whose job it is to kind of sell our creative industries, sell us as a global maker city abroad, sell us as a leader in arts and culture overseas. I mean, in some ways we sell ourselves through all of the amazing things that all of the people who, in Detroit now and who've come before us have done. But how could we galvanize all of that creative power and all of that cultural power that we have as a kind of soft power to sell Detroit on a global stage. And so there's some thinking on that, and we would invite everyone in the audience, if you have ideas about this, to reach out, because I think this is a really powerful idea and way that we can look at sort of what the Heidelberg Project has done organically to sort of lift up challenges and opportunities in Detroit, but how can we do that for the entire city? And what would that structure look like, and what would the participation look like, and how would we involve people in that process? So, I mean, this is just a little bit about sort of the process that we use to try to think about those questions, and what were the ways that we could get people also involved without them having to travel, because I think one of the interesting things about this notion of building bridges overseas is you don't actually have to have a passport, you don't actually have to travel outside of Detroit in some ways to be able to build global relationships and to be able to build this kind of urban diplomacy network. We are an incredibly global city as it is. We have incredible global diversity within our neighborhoods with each other already. And so what are the things that we could be doing to sort of travel or to, sort of connect with the rest of the world, but without ever having to leave home, so to speak. And so I just wanted to sort of end by sort of looking at what is, so what are those kinds of, what are some examples of this notion of urban diplomacy, or how could we each individually think about building bridges globally, but in very practical ways. And so, one thing that we do as part of our work with our company Salonier is this idea of dinner diplomacy. So we all like to eat. We all like to, sharing a meal is, the one of the most ancient forms of building bridges. And so how could we kind of use this notion of the shared meal, or coming together to share a meal, but have it be something that is connected to global culture. The idea of neighborhood diplomacy, which is sort of what I was referring to earlier just a minute ago, which is the notion of looking at all the global cultures that we have in our own backyard, in our own neighborhoods, and how can we connect what we're doing in arts and culture to that global nature of our neighborhoods. And I think there are ways that we can all kind of be urban diplomats and sort of thinking about how, very intentionally, about how we can build those bridges and make those connections. And then, digital diplomacy, obviously putting ourselves out there in international fora through social media and through other digital platforms. Travel diplomacy, this one I think is really interesting for those of us who like to travel. I think it's interesting to consider being very intentional about how we might be able to build bridges for the arts and cultural community here in Detroit every time we travel. So, for example, when I travel, I try to think about what are one or two meetings that I could take that may or may not have anything to do with my business, but that are supportive of what's happening here in Detroit in the arts and cultural space. So it could be anything from meeting with an expat Detroiter in that city. It might be taking a media interview. It might be, talking with a museum or cultural institution in another place about what's happening in Detroit and offering to make connections or build relationships, just because that's a great thing to do and because it helps to amplify what's happening here and build networks. Cultural diplomacy, and this is just kind of the summary of it all, which is to just be very intentional about thinking of considering how all the work that we're all doing here in the arts and culture space, how can we think intentionally about one or two global connections that we could be making anywhere in the world? If that's not something we're already doing, what could we be doing more to get the word out there and to talk about all the many great things that are happening here that go beyond sort of what's happening in the press, which tends to be a bit repetitive and not as robust and rich as I think it could be. The same things keep getting reported over and over again at a very high level, and there's not enough digging into the details around what's truly interesting and granular and special about what's happening across the board here in Detroit and the arts and culture space, and what can we do each individually to empower ourselves and the people around us, because each of us can. I mean, when I came to Detroit, and this was my job, I can tell you, when I started to meet with people, I got the straight up stare, like, what? Why do we care about this? Like, what? Urban diplomacy? Why? And you know, it's a process. You have to be really committed to it. You have to really decide that this matters, because there's so much that matters just in our own backyard that's happening right now. I think it's easy to say, and for many, many good reasons, to say this isn't important. But in fact, it is really important for so many reasons, that we are connected to our kindred spirits in other places in the world who can relate to us and who could maybe be inspired by what's happening here, but also just because it enriches everyone to have these bridges and to have these global partnerships and ideas sort of coming back and forth and informing and also inspiring what we're doing in our backyard. So HP diplomacy, it's a new thing. Check it out, support it, create your own. I just made that up, but I do think it's what's been happening organically through the Heidelberg project. I think it's one of our greatest examples of how a single person, Tyree Guyton, who decided to pick up a paintbrush and make a difference, has changed the lives of people all around the world, affected a young diplomat who was inspired by his work, helped that person tell a story about Detroit that no one wanted to hear at the time. And I think all of us can pick up our own paintbrush and build those kinds of bridges abroad.
Dietrich will invite you up. I think this is the clicker.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing?
Great.
So, actually, it was the Salonier dinner that Julie invited me to when I saw all the beautiful artwork of Tyree hanging on the wall, and decided to then purchase one, which is now hanging in my office and gets a lot of attention by everybody who walks through it. So there is a clear link between what Julie does in the urban diplomacy and how we then carry that message forward. But actually, as you can tell, I speak Jinglish, as I say, and that's because I lived 27 years in Germany before I moved to English-speaking countries, and I've now lived. What's that? Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much. I feel willkommen. But I've lived outside of Germany for the last 26. That makes me 53 years old, and you know, it is. It's Detroit really that captured my, you know, my interest, my imagination on what can we do in the real estate and art space, and that started when a friend took me on a tour in 2013 of Detroit, and one stop, of course, was the Heidelberg project, and it was cold out, I remember, and as it was. Tyree was outside, and so we walked around, and there he is, and we talked, and I took photographs, and I looked down, and there was that house with all the shoes down below, and it wasn't so easy to fully understand, you know, what Tyree was talking about, but it was a memorable experience nonetheless, and through the Salonier and through Janine and today, you know, when I drive by and I see him, I get to just get outside and give him a hug, and it's just it's a wonderful experience for me as a complete newcomer to Detroit, and for you as somebody who has been here all his life and has made this difference. My topic really is about you know, arts, culture, and real estate. And maybe if you go to the next, oh wait a minute, I do that. Wait a minute, here we go. Maybe I'll just give you a quick overview of the company. And actually, Peter Cummings, who is my partner in the platform, is sitting here and supporting me, which we do. So that's very nice. And those 7 bullet points up there on the slide summarize what Peter and I set out to do when we started the company. And I think you can see that there is a little bit something different in here than just sort of build a building as cheaply as you can, charge the highest possible rents, and get out as fast as you can. Now, in some ways, in a market economy, you have to allow for that to happen too, and you cannot immediately demonize it. But you are allowed, as a participant in a market economy, to seek other ways of doing it. And in these bullet points, you know, some of our philosophy is very much reflected. And in some ways, it always comes back to, you know, how do we create community? What sustains it? What makes a neighborhood live on after development has taken place? How do we figure out a way to not push people out? You know, all of that is, in the end, connected to arts and culture in our neighborhoods. I'm not going to read these to you, but I think it gives you a sense for you know, what we try to do at the company. And I thought maybe it would be useful to show you a couple of photographs that gives you examples of the activity that we do in our developments and how we incorporate artists and culture and ultimately try to span it from local to global. I also just want to briefly tell you that I was at a conference yesterday that was hosted by the AIA, the American Institute of Architects. They brought together 35, 40 people from around the country, leaders of the large architectural firms. And we spoke about Detroit and what makes Detroit different. And one takeaway from the panel that I was sitting on, which included Maurice and Arthur and a few other people, was that this is the place where we go after an inclusive recovery. And probably the only place in the country where you can really say that an effort is being made. You know, whether it's successful, I think we'll have to, I don't know that anybody knows that yet. And I don't know that anybody should anticipate that quite yet, but just the mere fact that an effort is being made to create an inclusive recovery of a city like Detroit is quite remarkable. And here again, I think that arts and culture play an enormous role in it. So let's go to the next slide, and that shows you an example of what we're doing at the Fisher Building. Fisher Building, all of you know it. It's in the geographic center of the city. In many ways, it is the beacon for Detroit, as prominently branded by my friend Everett Findlay, who is also sitting here in the audience. Everett came up with that because, in fact, it is the beacon in the middle of the city that sort of beacons out to all the neighborhoods around us. And so one day, after having walked the building, and we realized that there's a floor, the 4th floor, which historically was a bunch of medical offices, so it has a beautiful historic corridor, and then very small individual offices, spaces all next to each other. Most of them are vacant. And somebody on our team suggested, well, this would be really great if we could turn this into artist studios. And so quickly we put together a very simple program where we said, okay, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and this is what you're going to get, and let's put it in cranes and see what happens. And that's what we did, and this phone hasn't stopped ringing since. So you see a nice example here of artists that are coming in to, and all kinds of artists, graphic artists, performing artists, photography, fabrics, metals, you name it. And they're taking these studios, we make them available to them at a relatively low rate, and we make them available on a temporary use agreement basis, which means that you only commit to a year. And it's 2 pages to read, not 50 pages to read, not a lease that is legally very complicated and takes and basically ties you up for 5 years, but something very simple. And it's very successful. And in fact, what happens is that from this community, economic development happens, right? So we actually ourselves, as the platform, we hire, there's one graphic artist here who is very good, and when we have marketing materials to produce, we hire him to help us do that. We also hired artists from the 4th floor to create a mural in a corridor at Baltimore Station 1, which is one of our developments, where these young artists, mostly graduates from CCS, College for Creative Studies, have an opportunity to display their work. Do the work, display the work. So again, a really interesting relationship between something as simple as putting an article in Crane saying the 4th floor in the Fisher Building is available for lease. This is Old Redford. It's Old Redford, some people refer to it as at Brightmoor. It's sort of right at on the edge. It's at the intersection of Lazar Road and Grand River. For 3 years we've been working on a development there, which is closely linked to the Artist Village. Chaz Miller, a local artist in Detroit. Again, an opportunity here to tie his work into what's going on in the neighborhood. This is not only his Artist Village, there's also an alley that we're going to create. There's a billboard on top of that building. You see it a little bit there on the bottom left. And those are all ways to introduce the arts to a broader audience. Interestingly enough, and I put the cover here a month ago in the French magazine Le Figaro. The lead article was about Old Redford, Brightmoor, and we call it the Obama Building in Detroit. And just very interesting if you think about global, local to global, how that community, and then of course a bigger story around Detroit, but how it made it into a prominent magazine published in France. And then of course most recently we had the Financial Times that Julie was quite involved with to write a whole separate report about Detroit. So I think there you can see the global brand that Detroit is anyway because of the auto industry and its history, but how even today that sort of feeds through the arts and culture into the global network. And then lastly, I want to show you this this slide, which is again goes back to the Fisher Building and the Beacon projects. And again, Everard is the curator of that, and we've had numerous Beacon projects since we've purchased the building, and each and every one of them is a way to tie arts and culture or local maker community into the global conversation around real estate and development and making the city a better place. So you see the first image there on the top is that's actually Vince McWilliams, who owns a clothing company called Kill the Hate, and he was one of the makers that were prominently featured in that first exhibition about makers and change makers in Detroit. Carlos was also featured in that exhibition, and that was a great way, to tie the whole city, makers and change makers from all over the city, into the Fisher Building, and then give it the platform for a global audience. We have the book displayed, photographs from the book The Dream Is Now from Michel Arnaud, a French photographer, and we actually just recently opened an exhibition from Oliami Davos about his work from the civil rights era. So those are just ways for us to have arts come together at the Fisher and display it and connect it to the rest of the world. Another, and maybe sort of the pinnacle of the whole Drive Local, Go Global initiative is the Maker City app, which we've created, again under the curation of Everard to create a tool that allows everybody from very local in your living room to connect to the world through the social media vehicle. So Maker City, mkrcity.com, or the app is essentially that. It's a social media platform for artists and makers that allow the locals to connect to the world. The world could be, it could be New York, it could be Chicago, it could be Paris or Frankfurt or Beijing. It could be through the internet, it doesn't really matter, right? And how you can find goods, services, things that are made here, art, and you can find it, source it through that app, and it creates that global connection. So again, I think in closing, arts and culture in a neighborhood is what gives it stabilization and sustainability. And you can look in many other cities. My favorite example is Soho in Manhattan, which was so cool for so many years, and everybody wanted to move there, and everybody did. And I don't know what houses are trading at now down there, but certainly too much in any event. And the people that made it cool and attracted everyone have since left. So all the people that paid a lot of money for these homes basically left with the CVS on the corner. And that's an outcome of real estate development that is not good, at least not in the long run. That may be good in the short run when somebody quickly buys and sells something, but in the long run it's not good. And if we focus and are intentional about keeping arts and culture in our neighborhoods, I think that we will have the longer term sustainability ahead of us. And so that's what we're trying to do, and that's what I wanted to tell you about. Thank you very much.
I've got questions for him. I don't know if you all do, but I certainly do. And I'm going to bring Jules up, but I do just want to offer one thought before we move on. Almost everyone today has said that they've gone down to Heidelberg and Tyree was out in the street with his push broom. And certainly when I've been down there, I've bumped into him and he's been out in the street with his push broom. Now I'm just wondering when he's had time to pick up the paintbrush. Because it sure sounds like you spend so much time outside talking to everyone and visiting with them. So I'm going to bring Jules up.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going by a very strict script because, believe me, you guys do not want me freewheeling this. So I apologize if I'm looking down at my paper a little bit. When Janine asked me to be a part of this panel, my immediate reaction was, why? What wisdom do I really have to share about the international implications of the Heidelberg project? But the more I thought about my travels and my work all over the world amongst different cultures, the more I realized that the Heidelberg project encompasses ideas that I have seen and participated with all over the world. So if you will, we're going to go on a little journey together. I was born and raised in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, one of the wealthy white suburbs of Detroit. And in 1988, I packed my bags and left for Portland, Oregon to attend Reed College. Now, this was the same year that Tyree began to receive national media attention, unbeknownst to me. While Tyree, as a black man, buckled down to work within his childhood community on the street of his childhood home, I jumped at my privileged white flight chance to get out into the world and to see where I landed. My journey from that day onward has led me all over the world. I've worked in dramaturgy, in off-Broadway theater, I was a Peace Corps volunteer and a global trainer in Sri Lanka. I've been a refugee camp manager in an active war zone. I'm a volunteer firefighter in Vermont, where I ran a homeless shelter and worked with women in prison. I'm a national level emergency management volunteer, helping artists recover from natural disasters. I'm a family donor advised fund manager. And I'm also a ceramic artist. But it was a rainy day in December of 2015 when I first learned of the Heidelberg Project through a casual comment from a friend. Without knowing what to expect, I showed up at the project, parked my car, and without another soul in sight, this was a December rainy day, I wandered in the cold rain, getting soaked to the bone with a smile on my face and soaking every second of it in. I walked every inch of the project and fell in love. Not with Tyree. I'm one of the few people that did not meet Tyree on site. I was there alone. And I didn't just fall in love with the art, but I fell in love with the reality that this nonprofit was using art as its main language to spark community engagement and development. I stood in the rain that December and HP's mission spoke to me. It didn't just speak to me, it crawled under my skin and it's refused to leave me alone. After 27 years of being gone to Detroit, I was shocked at the stark visual reality that I witnessed throughout the city. And so the next morning, as I boarded a series of flights from Detroit to Easter Island, which provided me with ample time to do academic research, I dug into a book that a friend had recommended, Beautiful, Terrible Ruins, Detroit and the Anxiety of Decline. And there, wouldn't you know it, on page 106 was Mr. Tyree Guyton and the Heidelberg Project. At that moment of serendipity, I knew that the HP was going to follow me wherever I went. I spent 2 weeks on Easter Island, on that ancient island in the Pacific Ocean. My days were spent learning the lore of the Hangaroa tribe, and in the evenings I would sit and research the cultural implications of Detroit's ruins within modern society. When I learned that every single statue across the island had all been toppled during tribal wars and were only truly quote-unquote discovered by modern society when outsiders came into the community and began to explore these large rock-like tables and ask questions. Now think about that. It took outsiders arriving and asking countless questions like, what is that? How did this happen? Why was this left this way? What's on the other side? And what would it look like if they were all standing again? This curiosity sparked the restoration of the statues over decades, and from the ashes of the rubble, an island regained its own heritage and pride. I found myself wondering about the parallels to the Heidelberg Project and started asking myself, what is that? How did this happen? Why was this left this way? What would it look like if they were all standing again? And started to dream of the houses of Heidelberg past rising once again out of the ashes, being rebuilt. This led me to reach out via email to the office and inquire about making a donation to the project all the way from Easter Island. An email that I had no idea how much would impact and change my life and would precipitate my own return to working in Detroit. As a community development volunteer in a rural village in Sri Lanka, I was trained in rapid rural assessment, where communities are brought together for a day to map their own needs and desires in their own words, setting their own collective goals and prioritizing them in terms of communal need. I watched in fascination as communities identified priorities I could never even have imagined. This, for instance, is an elephant scarecrow, made from recycled resources within the village to keep the elephants from wandering off the open roads and into the fields so that the elephants would not eat the farmers' crops. The lesson? Every community has its own individual needs, and outsiders cannot begin to fathom the priorities of the needs of a given community. It takes change agents spending time listening to the community in order to help make that change be successful. The Galapagos Islands taught me that human beings feel empowered when turning the physical problems that plague their community into a thing of beauty with a message all its own. This artist spends his days combing the streets of Santa Cruz Island in the Galapagos, picking up cigarette butts the tourists leave behind. And he then turns them into elaborate sculptures that those same tourists buy and ship off island, which keeps the toxins out of the ocean and the local landfills. The lesson? Things that hurt us can be turned into something beautiful given enough creativity and determination. My time in Nepal taught me that weaving bright and beautiful colors into our reality can heal our drab outlook on life. This picture was taken during the Hindu holy holiday, known as the Festival of Color and Love, which signifies the end of the darkness of winter. And it's a day to meet others, play and laugh, repair broken relationships by dousing each other in all of the colors that the earth has to offer. The lesson? We all need to lift ourselves out of the darkness and beautify our worlds with color. Color heals. My time in Iceland taught me that humor is imperative. This island of fire and ice has repeatedly shown me that human beings can survive in many of the harshest of climates by relying on two things: humor and the people in their rural communities to show up for each other, no matter how difficult the circumstances. The lesson? Oh, come on, please don't be Godot. We all need to show up when needed. And you have to keep your sense of humor front and center. Make everyone around you smile. My time in a refugee camp in Sri Lanka and living within an active combat zone taught me that we cannot give in to hopelessness. This picture shows a group of grandmother elders praying for the family of a dying infant. No matter how dire the circumstances or the situation, as human beings, we need to continue to get up every single morning and ask, what can I do to try and make my day and the day of my neighbors better? What is within my power to change for the better? How can I help myself and others? The lesson? When we need it most, hope and help, love and compassion will show up. My time in Greenland with Natural Habitat took me into the farthest remote reaches of the planet's ice pack than I'd ever imagined possible. Here, I helicoptered over Greenland's largest ice sheet, and I saw for myself the drastic effects of global warming. I visited with rural Inuit hunters who spoke of the decline of the polar bear populations in areas where the ice is thinning more and more each year, and learned that many isolated hunting islands have now become abandoned due to lack of adequate food supply in the long winter months. I also learned that within the harshest corners of the planet, where few human beings care to comfortably go, there is immense beauty and peace to be found. The lesson? Reflections matter. Things are not always as they first appear to be. Where one thing ends and another begins can be very hard to differentiate. And taking the time to reflect on the environment we find ourselves in matters. Go to the places that scare you, and you will find immense beauty. And most importantly, change has to happen now. Sometimes there is no time to waste. My recovery work last April in Puerto Rico taught me that the government is neither willing nor able to respond to every single problem and every need that arises during the disasters that befall us as human beings. and that we must rely on our own inner strength and help from those inside our own communities who are willing to show up and do the hard work needed to begin to rebuild. The lesson? No one's going to show up and miraculously save you. You have to show up for yourself and your community first. So now we return to the HP. I remember the teachings of my graduate school thesis advisor's words, Janaki Natarajan, amazing, amazing Tamil woman about this tall, who I'm terrified of. She said to me, "So many of you white American children are taught to go out into the world and find yourselves, while bumbling in the dark to fix the problems of the, quote, underdeveloped world, end quote, with your volunteerism. Why is it that the impoverished communities in the developing world are supposed to act as a training ground for your intellectual experimentation? Stay in America first. Look at your own society and try to fix that before you go off and try to save the rest of us." As a privileged white woman, this agonized me to hear. And as a former Peace Corps volunteer, I cringed when I reflected the accuracy of this statement. Janaki was the most challenging and wonderful teacher I've ever had, and as a current donor and board member of the Heidelberg Project, I smile with pride when I hear Tyree unknowingly channel her wisdom. I'm going to end this presentation with the wisest words I have ever heard from Tyree, and those of you who know Tyree know that he is an endless supply. This was from Detroit Arts Week earlier this year. Is it not loaded?
Like a separate file.
Okay, it didn't come through, but what this is this is Detroit, this is during Detroit Arts Week, and it's Tyree speaking about how he wants to have friends all over the world, and that he believes he can have friends all over the world. He's already met people from 144 different countries. And he knows sometimes that in order to get it right, he has to get it wrong, and he has to make mistakes. And in the end of the quote, he says, "I believe that we can heal the world, but we have to start by fixing it here. If we fix it here and we heal it here, we can fix it everywhere because we fixed it here."
Hallelujah.
Thank you for that. And Aku's going to come up and bring home for us our last presenter.
I'm little. This way. So yeah, I'm gonna just be anecdotal and tell a few stories. I could have brought some visuals, but I didn't do that. But I did bring a quote that I want to start and just talk about kind of big, the world and places, and I've lived in a few places myself. I wanted to start my presentation today with a quote that I found from Dr. Hudita Noura Mustafa, who's a scholar and an anthropologist. And she's talking about the city of Dakar, Africa. And I sort of like the comparison, Dakar, Detroit, Black City, ruins, all that. The quote is, "Dakar is a colonial ruin, and ruins produce shards, uneven and textured fragments that puncture wounds at moments of encounter. By ruins, I refer to the cityscape of buildings, images and lore which are embedded in unsustainable colonial legacies and contemporary uncertainties. Spectacles make the ruins productive by enabling the emergence of dreams, images, and events from the ruins of the city. From this dialectic of ruin and spectacle emerged the utopia and dystopia of today's urban culture. The promise of public space, of new practices, identities, and communities." And I felt that personified what Heidelberg really means to me. It allowed us to dream about Detroit in many ways. So I start there. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to visit Montgomery, Alabama. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Theater and Performance at Spelman College. And we had the artist Zanelli Maholi, who's an extraordinary South African photographer. Yes, my heart. And she was visiting us at Spelman. We opened a lovely exhibition of hers. We wanted to take her someplace special. And we were thinking about taking her to the King Center, and we thought to take her to the National Museum of Civil Rights, Human and Civil Rights in Atlanta. But that wasn't good enough. And I went away, we were having breakfast together, and I went away from the table, and they said, you know what? We're gonna go to Montgomery, Alabama. And in Montgomery, Alabama is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Museum. And that's where we went on the Monday. Now, there was a soundtrack going around and around in my head. And it was a quote from Grandpa Sam Mackey that went around and around in my head. And also an image of the shoes that I used to see on Heidelberg Street that were hanging from the trees. And Grandpa Sam Mackey said you could see their souls swinging in the wind. And this soundtrack kept going as I was reading names throughout the counties of the United States, because there were lynchings from New York to Wyoming and from Mississippi to Ohio, Michigan. There were lynchings. And what they've done today at that museum is that they put the names of the counties and the names of the people. And those people will be recognized in their counties when their names are identified. And I was able to reflect really deeply, but I also was able to think about where I came from, Detroit. And I was able to think about the Heidelberg Project as I was having that moment there. So that's where it started for me. But I want to talk about now, as I said, it's going to be anecdotal, so I'm going to switch it up. I want to talk about how I met Tyree Guyton. It was 2000, and my friend, the late Ron Milner, who's been a very dear friend and a mentor to me, he asked me, he said, who do you want to meet in Detroit? Because I was coming in from my home. I lived in Sydney for most of my adult life. That's Sydney, Australia, too, if you want to, make the bigger picture. Yes. And he said, who is it that you want to meet in Detroit? And I said, there's only one person I want to meet, and that's Tyree Guyton. So he rang him up. It was Christmas night, I think. And the following day we had breakfast. And so in walked Tyree and Janine. And I stand up because I'm pretty excited. I'm kind of an excitable person. You probably can't tell. But anyway, I'm sort of excitable. And they walk in, and I stand up when he comes in, and I shoot my hand across the table. And I say, hi, my name is Aku. How would you like to come to Sydney? And that's the first thing that kind of blurted out of my mouth. And that was kind of like, oh, yeah, hi, who are you? Yeah, let's sit down and meet. But don't worry, it took me 4 years. And I created a project called Singing for That Country. And I was able to invite Tyree to come. And that year I invited he and Janine to come. They made 3 trips in that year to Sydney. And we created a project that included the community there. I worked many years, all the years that I was there, I worked with the indigenous community that was there. And I also worked in the community. South Sydney also is experiencing what we talked about this morning about cities all over the world are experiencing this gentrification, and its capital coming in. When I like that I'm referencing Michael Stone Richards at the moment, talking about capital coming into a place and changing it. So this was a community where a lot of indigenous and poor working class people lived. And of course, Sydney is really, and it was also where the train station, the major exchange, Redfern and Waterloo, is coming in. So train stations and transport and moving around quickly are really important to gentrifying and getting people in there, and real estate going up. And we worked with the young people there, and we had young people painting shoes and painting tires and painting pictures, and we were to display them in Redfern Park, which is a big park which had been reclaimed. It had been a place, a brickworks, and then it was the garbage, it was where they dumped rubbish for years, and then they reclaimed that, and then it became this beautiful park again. And so we had that. But what I thought about was we put an installation up, and we had tires, and it looked quite beautiful. I could have bought pictures, but I didn't. I want you to use your imagination. And we put the tires and shoes up. But the next day we came back, the kids had cut the tires down and started rolling them down the hill and rolling them through the streets. And they made it into a PlayStation. So that's what happened. It evolved. The artwork evolved into a PlayStation. So that's just a little story about Sydney. But it goes on. I wanted to when I went to Spelman, I wanted to invite Tyree and Janine to Spelman. But I'll tell you why I wanted to invite them to Spelman. I was invited there as a distinguished visiting professor, but I'd seen the Heidelberg TV on Heidelberg Street. And like I said, I'm a little bit excitable, a little bit of a performer always. Even being a professor, the cool thing is I said, I get to perform every day. So I jumped into the television on Heidelberg Project, and there was a little doll sitting there next to it. And then I had a conversation with the doll, and I thought, this is such a cool thing. I want to bring it to the campus of Spelman. So I invited Tyree and Janine to come as guests, and we did a lecture in the museum. That was all very well. But what I loved is we made Heidelberg TV. And we put the TV on the middle of the campus, and on Market Friday, people passed by, and their alter egos came to life. A lot of people jumped in the television, they became television presenters. People jumped in, they wanted to read their poems. People jumped in, oh yeah, it was also, the vagina monologues were being done, so we had a couple of giant vulvas visit us in the television space. So it just elicits all kinds of people came, and it was a place to play in. And that's what Heidelberg Project also elicits. And then the final story, I'm just going to keep it kind of brief, is the magic of Heidelberg. So I was here in Detroit 2 weeks ago. I'm working on a project with Jessica Care Moore. We're doing Salt City at Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. And we're to do that next year in June 2019. And I was, because Detroit has changed a lot. And my mother and I were trying to think of a place to go for dinner, and I thought, well, maybe I should just type in, where are the cool restaurants to go to? So I was on my computer looking for someplace different to go eat, because we're kind of creatures of habit. And one of those little things shoots across my computer, and I get a message on Facebook. Well, I don't have Facebook on my phone anymore because I can't do it anymore. But it came across the screen. And I decided to check it out. I just thought, okay, when you're on the computer and you're scrolling and looking for something to eat. It's a message from a friend of mine. Her name is Yi Che Young. And I lived in Seoul for a couple of years, from 2011 to 2013. And Che had been a translator I directed Tommy at my university there. And she was the translator on the project. Che Kyung is on Heidelberg Street. And she said, I'm standing with Tyree, and I mentioned you to him. And he says, of course I know her. You should call her up. Well, she didn't have my phone number, because we haven't seen each other in about 5 years. So she sends me the message. So when I get it, it was a few minutes later, because I didn't check it out immediately, and I said, are you still there? Are you on Heidelberg Street? But she answered back, and she said, yes, I'm still here. I said, I'm 10 minutes away. Wait for me. And Che was here with the Bread and Puppet Theater Company. If any of you know theater, Bread and Puppet is like a legendary. I was like, bow down. Yes, Bread and Puppet. I knew them from like the 60s. I've been following them since I was in high school. And they were here. They performed the night before, which I sadly did miss, but they were here. Che was traveling with them. And so I had a beautiful reunion with a friend that I hadn't seen in a lot of years, who also had a really interesting year. Her father was called the Samsung of the theater world. And she just needed a little break from family and friends in Korea. But I had this reunion with Che on Heidelberg Project. And so that's just that to me is how the world often will come right to you. And what I love about Heidelberg is it'll come to you on the street. Yes, all roads lead to Heidelberg. And finally, I know Jessica is not here. I saw her walk out of the room, sadly. But I just wanted to end with, Jessica Care Moore has a poem that's called Detroit, and it starts out real edgy. Detroit, I'm from Detroit, and then it goes dun 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 dun. I'm from Detroit, and it ends. The D's in my blood, no matter how far I go, no matter how far I go, no matter how far I go. The D's in my blood, no matter how far I go, no matter how far I go, no matter how far I go. The D's in my blood.
As her mother, I must say she was always very quiet.
Thank you for that. This is where the interaction starts and the dialogue starts, so let's open it up to questions and comments. And I'm gonna pass the mic, so just let me know you wanna talk.
Platform group. How many artists are on the fourth floor?
How many?
Yeah.
Boy, I don't know that I know the actual number. Many,
So there are a lot of spaces.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, each floor in the Fisher Building is two wings, one along Grand Boulevard, the other one along Second. In that part of the building, each floor is about 35,000 square feet. And so that fourth floor has a wide corridor that goes down each wing, and that's a historic corridor, so it's clad in marble and very beautiful. And then you have a row of offices on one side of the corridor and a row of offices on the other side of the corridor. So all in, there's probably 35 to 40 offices there. And I would say at the moment we have maybe 15 to 20 artists in there.
Okay. Thank you.
So I had a platform group question, sort of, and I'm gonna go into it a roundabout way, but I think part of how the auto industry ended up being so successful in America is because there were tens and tens and tens of auto companies all trying to chase the dream of the mobile transportation. And Detroit and Michigan, Southeast Michigan, we ended up with a critical mass of companies here. And in some ways they formed alliances, in some ways they came together, but there were a lot of people working on that direction of mobile transportation. And I think the Heidelberg project is fantastic, and what I'm interested in is how do we create a big critical mass of art and culture in this community that can grow and grow and grow. So my question to you is, not all developers are as intentional about being inclusive in the community. So I'd like you to maybe give us 1 or 2 tips on how to get the attention of developers so that we could get more folk thinking similar to how Platform seems to be thinking on this.
Well, maybe first of all, I think in Detroit, I think you actually have more thinking going on along those lines than maybe you think. And so I'm not going to, talk about the others. I prefer talking about us, because I think that's the only thing that I can control, right? But I will tell you that Detroit, for example, in my opinion, is a place of lots of prominent community development corporations. They too are, in the development business. Now, I know that there's communities that are not happy with their CDCs, but there are other communities that feel well represented by the CDCs. It goes just with anything. You have different opinions around the table, but community development corporations play an important role in a city like Detroit. we've started a Detroit Developer Roundtable. We've had our third meeting. We were what we wanted to make sure is that we don't end up with the usual suspects around the table, and there's probably 3 to 6 of us. That was not the objective, right? So what we tried to do is create a group, and I think we threw the net out really wide. And just at our last meeting, we had 27 people, which means maybe there were a couple of twosomes there, but generally speaking, there were 25 or so development companies represented. Everybody from, the very largest ones to the very smallest ones. And in the end, all we can do is communicate with each other, talk to each other, lead by example. I also said earlier already in my quick talk that it is really important that we find economically sustainable solutions. So, we need to find ways to develop real estate with the community in mind, but yet it needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, so to speak, economically speaking, because otherwise all we're doing is just propping up the system, and that is not in the long run sustainable. It will ultimately collapse onto itself. So I think just a conviction that arts and culture as a centerpiece of community development, once we have that, then the rest sort of falls out of it. I also, this is sort of something again that came from this meeting yesterday, we talked a lot about intentionality. If we do things with intention, typically diversity, inclusion, and equity will fall out of that. So our company, and Peter, he had to leave to catch an airplane, but we started our company very much with a focus on intentionality, on everything, from how we create our team, where we office, what projects we take on, and so on. And I feel that there's a shift more towards intentionality going on in the development community, and nobody will always be the same, and that's okay. So again, I don't really want to talk so much about the others. All I can say is that I'm quite pleased with how many people are engaged in pursuing a different way to develop in the city of Detroit. I think we should be quite happy with where we are, and I think it's on a good path, in my opinion.
I was just going to say on the real estate front, one thing that I think the platform does so well, and others in the city, some others, and that is something that I think is really important in other cities globally, is this question of how artists are included in real estate developments, whether it be commercial, residential, hospitality, and so on. One of the projects that we're working on right now is addressing this question, which is to say that it seems that in all of the many real estate projects that are happening around the city, there is a handful, I think, of artists that are doing such a great job of marketing themselves or getting in front of some of the developers and are being included in these projects in one way or another, but it's not good enough. There isn't really a way of kind of leveling the playing field in terms of making opportunities to be part of these real estate developments, whether it's a public commission or whether it's interior artwork inside the developments, whether it's thinking about how the development is happening from a creative perspective. And so one of the things that we're working on is to create public calls so that, so we're calling it the Detroit Artist Inclusion Project. We're going out and negotiating with individual real estate developers in these various areas and basically saying, we want you to commit to a percentage of your build-out budget to be dedicated to including art and culture in your space, and to commit to public calls so that you're not just, because your interior designer happens to like so-and-so or what have you, that's not your decision-making process. And so it's a nascent thing right now, but we're Dietrich and I have talked about it, but we're in the process of starting this, and I think that other cities do this, and some other cities, in fact, like city council mandates that certain percentage of things get included, and that's also a very top-down, very heavy way of doing things. But I think that it's worth, as we kind of think about how real estate is done in the city, like how exactly, like what is our process exactly for including artists in all of these many real estate development projects. So we have this one little idea, I'm sure other people have better and other ideas as well, but I think it's something that's really important.
I also want to say, in my community, we do want to build our community, and we don't always feel too kindly with developers coming in and not asking us anything. They just come in, and we don't want that. We want to be part of our community development. So I hope that when you guys do come in, that you will deal with we have associations, we have block clubs, and we would like to be notified, and perhaps we can come to the table with some type of balance there.
I'll just comment on that. I think the first time I met Dietrich, I don't know if he remembers this, was in my living room. Because the platform group is working on a development in my neighborhood, and they reached out, they wanted to talk to the folks that live there. And we pulled our association together, and they came over to my house, and we sat and we talked for a couple hours about our neighborhood and how we saw our neighborhood and what we wanted. So
Good.
I feel like they have a model that does that pretty nicely, and I think you've done a lot of work over in the Fitzgerald neighborhood. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what the process is and how you do that community engagement work.
Yeah, Fitzgerald is it's a big undertaking. It's a revitalization of a whole neighborhood. And that's really, we're doing that in partnership with a group called Century Partners. And they are really in the lead on that. They're very good at community engagement, home rehab, community building. And so I would give them all the credit for that. Another place where we do a lot of community engagement is in Island View, which is that's sort of really how my involvement in the city started, by attending a church there called Church of the Messiah, and then ultimately pursuing the acquisition of some real estate, and it was really it was just a great experience to be so close to the community and have an opportunity to speak to them, hear, just like you said, ma'am, hear everybody's ideas and opinions, and then of course the trick is to incorporate that somehow, and that's not always easy, and not always everybody is going to be completely happy with what happens at the end, but at least there's a good dialogue from the very beginning. And we did that in Island View. We also did that in Old Redford, where we've done work for a long time. Peter and his wife have done a lot of work there over the years, and we know all the community leaders, all the local retailers, and have a good sense and constant dialogue about what it is that the community wants out of the rehabilitation of these currently vacant buildings. So it takes effort for sure, because it's obviously easier to just close the door and do what needs to be done, and then sort of open the curtain and say, here it is. But again, I think Detroit is a place where the dialogue, and I sit often at these tables, and I hear your comment at every event that I'm at. So it's very hard for me to forget And that's good, because, you know, there's a constant reminder. And there's so many of these panels that are being put together that discuss this topic. And every once in a while, you know, things get a little louder, and that's okay too, because, you know, at least we're alive and we're expressing our opinions. But then in the end, the proof will be in, okay, when we develop something, will you find your ideas in that development? And I think we're still a couple of years out from that, because of course most of the stuff is under construction at the moment. So how it all integrates into the community has yet to be proven out. We have a position in our company called Director of Design and Culture. I've never worked at a real estate company that has that position. That's a truly Detroit phenomenon, you know, where you have somebody who focuses on the cultural integration of a new development, even if it was on a surface parking lot. But now that surface parking lot is improved with a new building, and how do we integrate that new building into the culture of the surrounding community? So a lot of thinking goes on in that regard, and I think that's very beneficial.
Hello panel, I have an observation and also a comment. The observation is, when we speak or you speak of art, it used to be art and crafts. And the craft sector of art give an artist the sustainability, so he can craft something that he can carry to the marketplace. And craft is, even in the government description of General Service Administration and so on, is described as arts and crafts. And so I wonder if with Tyree's displays in the Heidelberg project, it speaks of a tremendous amount of surplus and waste that we accumulate as we go along, and that it is is to discard. And I think the skilled trades that built originally the Paris of North America, the skilled trades that give an artist bread and butter, so he can implicate his skilled trades maybe in the historical districts, maybe in the Fisher building, that it's an economy. And to refine maybe the economy of art, what is the economy of visual art, what is the economy of building art, what is the economy of sculptures and monuments that adorns our parks and landscapes, that's supposed to speak of the people that live here. And the great void that represents the people that live here in the landscape, in the buildings, it is a frightful thing. That is the underlying step of gentrification. The not being part of the economy, right, and being not visible to anybody who just visiting here from another country. They understand there is something wrong here in Detroit, and we not considering the entire spectrum.
Can I just say, I want to say that the charge, and it's a little bit of an answer to the sister in the back, but some of that, what I think Tyree was attempting to show us on Heidelberg, sometimes the onus is on us as citizens to stand our ground.
Right.
Yeah. And put our voices. To me, as artivists and citizens, we've also given over to the wave of the tide that is before us, perhaps. And I think sometimes we have to charge, we gotta stand our ground, and that's something I felt I learned from Heidelberg. Sometimes you gotta go and put the terror on the houses. you gotta put the trees, the shoes in the trees. You gotta, that, it reminded us that we do have a voice and we have to say it, and maybe you have to make the art in the street. You know, when I was at Concept East all those moons ago as a teenager, you know, we used to do outdoor theater and the people would just stand around and see, because we took it outside instead of just always in the building. But we gotta remember, because I feel like as we become, you know, more device and individualized, we're less community in our desires to be together, and that we're stronger if we're a force as a community. So I throw a little bit the onus as these other forces come at us. Yeah, they're hard, big forces to deal with, but we also gotta link our arms and link our art.
I also would like to speak a little bit to what you were just talking about as a craft artist myself and as someone who's worked with a lot of craft artists throughout the country and the craft movement. Modern craft is really, really changing, and there's a really fascinating discussion going on right now between the difference of art and craft, and I think as everything else in society is happening, there's an opportunity for everything to blur together now. What was considered craft before, popsicle sticks, or people working with certain kinds of materials only. You know, there's a top 5 that have always been considered craft. In the last 2 decades, I've seen on a national basis, people really challenge this idea of the difference between art and craft, and especially craft being a dirty word. And I'm seeing a merging between people who create objects, that now it's about material-based creation and what you're trying to say through that. I've worked on some development projects down in different parts of North Carolina and Seagrove, North Carolina, and the very, very heavy-based ceramic communities. And I've watched those communities pull together to really blur through these lines and talk about craft and development and challenge people, challenge the government to take Superfund sites and turn them over to artists to start new manufacturing waves of glass and craft and metal artists all working within the same buildings, trying to blur these lines. So I do think that there's a really fertile ground right now for not looking at what separates all of us working as creatives, but trying to look at how we all are speaking the same language and how we can all lift each other up.
Okay, you said something earlier, and Carlos, I was listening to you. I would say to you, Carlos, that I came to the realization of understanding that I needed to do something for myself and for my community. I think a lot of times we are waiting. I don't want to wait. It's kind of like the butterfly effect. You got to become it. And that's what I have done. And for the last 30 years, I saw the need to fight for something that I believe in. John F. Kennedy said something. He said that it's not what your government can do for you, but what can you do for your government. So I've done something for my community, for the city, for the world. So I'm going to say it again. Stop waiting.
Yeah, I would like to add to that too. I come back and forth from New York to Detroit, and I've been doing that for, I think, a little over 3 years now, coming to work with the platform. And also, Carl, you know, we all have become really close friends going back and forth, coming to the Heidelberg project. I think there's this aspect of the market. There's the art market is the largest unregulated market in the world.
That's right.
When I'm in New York, I work with developers there, and when they speak about artists getting involved in some of their buildings, we're talking about projects with guys that are making $5 million a piece when they do a painting. I think this aspect of Detroit is a microcosm of America's challenges right now. Like this gives Detroit the opportunity to be the place that shows America that it is possible. Because in New York, gentrification, you know, it's a wrap. You said it was a wrap. But New York is still this place of amazing commerce and amazing possibility. And they really want to connect, that market really does want to connect with other places. So when things like the Heidelberg project happens, or a developer like the platform trying to create this aspect of development, but how do you develop with the community, with the artists, but not just there in the space, but connect to that marketplace. So you have all these tributaries coming in. So Carl, when you do your work, that's identified, just like Warhol and Soho and Basquiat happened. That's kind of the renaissance of that can happen here, and create a marketplace that can trickle down to people within community. So I do think it's like the coming together of all these different worlds that has not happened in a symbiotic way. And that's why I think these conversations have been really amazing, and Detroit has that possibility. So in the problem, embrace it, because the problem gives you the right to the opportunity.
Can I chime in one thing? Too? Yes, a real quick one. What I'm speaking of is the value that we already possessing in the community. I'll give you a concrete example. Our historical light poles, our historical light fixtures that are existing from when Edison installed them in 1897. That's all the black light poles that you saw around the neighborhood. Then in 1910 and 1920, all the light poles that adorn Gratiot all the way from downtown to 8 Mile, Michigan Avenue, Warren Avenue. Those light poles are Art Deco light poles. They needed to be restored. One of them in its restored condition cost about $80,000. Now you can do the math. $80,000 times 44,000. That alone would have paid back the city debt as an insurable value.
Right.
If we would employ the artistry, the skills that originally built those lamps, we would have maintained the value that other taxpayers already put into this landscape. That is belonging to the people that have a driver license that say Detroit. That's all I wanted to say. The value.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question to the gentleman of the developer. What is the scale of evaluating residential property that has become a site of art as an environment? Because of the appraisal of the property should consider the art and its established location as intellectual property. Don't you think so? Or what is your opinion on that?
Oh boy. It's a good thing I'm not an appraiser. So I think it depends on what, an appraisal happens when somebody orders it, somebody asks for it. And I think you have to remember, we have to keep in mind, you know, why is it asked for, why is it ordered, who orders it, and who performs it. You know, there's, the appraisal mechanism is an important part of the real estate industry in all aspects. It helps the seller, it helps the buyer, it helps the lender, it helps the owner to figure out where's the clearing price. It's a tool for a market economy, no doubt about it. And you know, you are asking, you know, how do we incorporate, you know, intellectual property, art, a public space into that thinking? And you know, I don't have an answer for you. I don't know. I know that it will. It's definitely a process. There's many places in the real estate world where the change in either our own attitude or our values or technology or how we think about where we want to work and how we want to work, all those changes have an impact on the appraisal. And an appraiser is somebody who is certified to be an appraiser. That person has they have knowledge, they have a skill. In the end, they need to write a report and then they put their stamp on the bottom. Would appraisers naturally sit in this room? Do we have an appraiser in the room? So, and quite honestly, I'm not that surprised. And I'm not that surprised because appraising in, at least up until now, and probably for a while longer, is very much it's a pretty dry matter. You look for what's around you. What was it appraised like yesterday? What was the last sale that happened? And then you look at all that and you do some math and some magic and you write a number on a piece of paper and you put your stamp on it. So I think it's going to be a while before those thoughts will find their way into the official appraisal process. I think if you ask for appraising, not so much in the official appraisal sense, but more in the sense of what is a public art institution, and I mean that's really the topic at heart here, right? I mean at the center of all of it. What is it worth? And how does it influence the price of land around it? You can't prescribe that. You need to let the market speak. If you prescribe it, I'm not sure you're doing yourself a favor. Then you're going the other direction. I think the trick is to maintain the market force with sensitivity and recognition to arts and culture in your surroundings, and a true belief that in the long run we will be better off protecting the arts and culture in our neighborhoods as opposed to tearing it down and replacing it with condominiums. But in the end, you need to leave it up to this audience to now go out in the world and tell people that, so that we as a society learn from that. Prescribing it, I'm not sure I'm a believer in that.
I think we could go on longer, but I'm already a really bad moderator because I've already gone over time and I didn't even notice it because I was just engaged in listening. So I've been told to wrap it up. Can you want to close it with a really quick?
Sorry, it's just a quick comment. It's not a question. I wasn't born in Detroit. I was born in India, but I have lived in the suburbs for 18 years, so Detroit is kind of home for me. I just wanted to say people come from outside. I don't think I'm an outsider. Obviously, I am from outside, but I want to say how small the world has become. You talked about the festival of Holi. I'm a Hindu and I've celebrated it throughout my life. Colors do heal, and that's why I became an artist and I love my art. You talked about diplomacy, and I really believe in that because I live in the suburbs and I can guarantee not 80% or more know about the Heidelberg project. We hear about the Heidelberg project from people visiting from other countries, and it's such a shame, and I do take it from you that I have to go and propagate it, that it's safe, you have to come there, and it's just incredible. And then you talked about German connection, and I just lived in Stuttgart for 4.5 years and got back a couple of years back. And you talked about being happy, and my husband says, why are you happy for the whole world? I can't create art if I don't hear music and dance. So thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to experience this.
Thank you.